Hey there, everyone. We are doing our last lecture for Bio 233, Anatomy and Physiology, and we're finishing up physiology for female reproductive system. So let's switch over to our lecture notes and remember where we are. So this page here starts talking about how we get an actual unfertilized egg released from the female reproductive system. And what it's showing here on this page, and this is on page 1070 as well, and you can look at that one if you want. This one's really pretty good, so I'm not going to switch over to 1070. I think we're just going to use this. And it kind of follows all the steps. And this picture, all the words that kind of explain it are right here on the next page. So what I think we're going to do is we're going to start here. We're going to start reading some things. Then we're going to go back and we're going to highlight stuff and type some things in and kind of go back and forth. I think that's the best way to do it. Okay, so let's look here. What's happening? So we want to look at production of female eggs. And it goes through multiple stages. We have to go through mitosis, also meiosis, and then the eggs have to mature and then eventually be ovulated. Okay, and this begins during fetal development. Amazingly, things are already starting during fetal development to allow the ovary to be able to release eggs throughout the life. And so by the time embryonic development has ended, there is about 700,000 primordial follicles that have been produced. And in those, remember, they're just thin, one layer, simple squamous epithelium surrounding an oocyte. Okay? And so that's what's going to happen in embryonic development. And then they will continue to grow during infancy, but they'll be halted sometimes through childhood. Sometimes they go a little bit longer. But for the most part, they don't develop too much during that part. But they will restart developing completely at puberty. And this is when FSH from the anterior pituitary starts to increase. Okay? And that's when follicle growth and maturation really begins. All right, and we'll come back to that. But let's now just highlight one or two things we want to say here. Okay, so what we're looking at here is before birth, we have mitosis, we have of the cells, and we have growth. And these are the ogonium, the stem cells, and we will make many, many, many primordial follicles. Okay, hundreds of thousands in each ovary. They get arrested, meaning they stop, in prophase 1 of meiosis at birth. And for the most part, as we said, they might grow and develop slightly. There's a slight change in their look there, but the ovary is relatively inactive during childhood. And then puberty occurs. And now what we want to do is we want to look at what happens in each month from puberty to menopause. All right, so now we're going to go back to our notes. We'll come back here. So usually only one primary oocyte each month will undergo meiosis 1, and it will produce 2 haploids of unequal size. Now, what actually often happens is more than one will do this, but only one will complete the entire process. So sometimes we see up to, I don't know, I think later we have, 20 to 25 primary follicles are activated monthly by hormonal stimulation, but we generally only get one that goes all the way to become an released ovum. So what'll happen, though, so let's think about what's going to happen, is so we're only going to look at one here. It'll undergo meiosis 1, first meiosis. Remember, so meiosis has got 2 duplications, one duplication and 2 divisions. And so it will undergo one of the divisions, and it will produce 2 haploids And remember, haploid is an N. So we're 2N, we're diploid. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And then if we only have one of those pairs available, one of each pair, we're called haploid or an N. I don't know if I can put it in there. So N, right, which is 23 chromosomes. I'll move that out of the way. That is haploid. It wanted to make it a big N, but it really is a little n. Okay, let's move that over. No, nope. Let's move that over. It won't let me move it anymore. Is that going to bother you? Hope not. Okay, so the haploids are 23 chromosomes, one of each, number 1, number 2, number 3, all the way down to number 22, and then we have our sex chromosome, so in either an X or a Y will be there. We'll talk about that in a minute. And what it does is it produces 2 haploids, but they're an unequal size. So we have a polar body and a secondary oocyte. So let's go back and look at that. So then what will happen is we will stimulate primordial follicles will get stimulated in the primary follicle, and that will get stimulated into secondary follicles. And we will have meiosis 1 completing. And what we end up getting is this thing called the first polar body. And what it is it's a 1N. Both of these are 1N, but it doesn't have all of the things that it needs, all the organelles and everything that will make it viable. And so basically what we're doing is we're putting all the cytoplasm and organelles and everything into this, which is now called the secondary oocyte. And that will eventually, ovulation will occur, and that's when our Graafian follicle, or vesicular follicle, not gallicle, follicle, will release the oocyte, and ovulation will occur. And that's what we're seeing here. So now let's go back. So during ovulation, the secondary oocyte and polar body are released from the ovaries. The secondary oocyte may or may not undergo a second meiotic division. Oh, excuse me, I apologize. I was thinking of the polar body. The secondary oocyte will not undergo the second meiotic division unless it becomes fertilized. If it's fertilized, the secondary oocyte will again divide and produce 2 cells of unequal size, both haploids. One is an ootid, which becomes the ovum, and a secondary polar body will form. Okay, and the ovum here is the fertilized egg. So overall, what we're noticing is, and we'll go back, show this. So now we have ovulation. Let's say we have fertilization. There's our sperm. So we know that fertilization has occurred. Then we get our meiosis 2 completion, our second division. And we now have an ovum, and it is a fertilized egg. But notice what has happened. This went and made a second polar body. So we have the first polar body here. We have our second polar body here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 cells. Now, this first polar body may or may not divide. It doesn't have to. It doesn't matter if it does, because it's not going to become an egg. But the point is this meiosis is like sperm in that we start with 1 stem cell and we get 4 cells. However, we only get 1 ovum. We only get 1 that is viable. And so all of the material goes into this one, and these polar bodies are inactive and are just absorbed by the body. So that's what this last statement says. Overall, one oogonia will produce, that's the stem cell, will produce one ovum, a fertilized egg, unlike one spermatogonia, which will produce 4 sperm. And so that's kind of an important point. I like that point because they're doing the same thing, meiosis, but their end result is a little bit different. Each month, the female is putting all of the energy and work into one ovary, or one oocyte, hopefully become fertilized. So that is what she's doing. Males are making many, many, many sperm in hopes that at least one of those sperm will reach this oocyte and then produce the ovum, the fertilized egg. All right, so now we have the ovarian cycle. And notice this. We've already kind of talked about this, right? We've already looked at the different cell types from primordial to primary to secondary primordial, primary, secondary in different forms, vesicular or Graafian follicle, ovulation occurring, corpus luteum, corpus albicans. So we've already talked about all those. But what we want to talk about is now lumping them together into different phases. And so we have follicular phase that occurs during the ovarian cycle, the ovulatory phase, and the luteal phase. So go to the next page. So you notice it says number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We're going to use those numbers on the next phase. So follicular phase, that should be down 1, but that's okay. We can see it there. By the way, this picture is seen on I don't know if it has it. Oh yeah, here it is on page 1072. So you can also see this on page 1072, and it kind of shows the different structures again, and it looks really good, and you can certainly look at that, but we'll follow along with our picture here. So follicular phase is really phases numbers 1 through 6, okay, of those. So we have hormones that are going to stimulate and cause the follicles to start to grow. So primary follicles are activated and continue growing during the follicular phase. Remember, we start at a single layer of cells that surround the oocyte, and then there's also this. So that multiple layer of cells is called the zona granulosa, and it will be surrounded by the theca folliculi, which is a fibrous capsule. So once we see this, we are multicellular around the oocyte, and this is the fibrous outer capsule that kind of holds it in place, which is kind of shown here by these little dark lines there. The zona pellucidum, which is this clear non-cellular membrane, is around the oocyte. You can kind of see that there and up above. But it's still the oocyte, even though there's that little layer around it, is right next to the granulosa cells. That the follicular cells are turning into granulosa cells, and that's fine. As we said before, as it grows, we'll get an antrum, usually on one side, and as that fluid increases, the oocyte gets displaced to one side, and it has some new cells that go around it, which now are called the corona radiata, or it's like a little radiating crown around the oocyte. The follicle kind of starts to bulge out at the edge of the ovary, and this is where it's a Graafian or vesicular follicle. And this is where the first meiotic division is then completed, right? We were just talking about that. Then we have our ovulatory phase. And ovulatory phase is number 7 up above, which is this right here where ovulation occurs. So it's just that one little brief moment in time. And the Graafian follicle will rupture and release the secondary oocyte into the abdominal pelvic cavity. Remember, we said it goes into the peritoneal cavity first. The secondary oocyte still has the corona radiata around it, those granulosa cells, and the oocyte is now swept into the ampulla of the uterus by the fimbriae. Now, as a little aside, there's this thing called Mittelschmerz, and Mittelschmerz literally is German, which literally translates into middle pain like pain in your middle, and there we go, put it there. And this is actually pain during ovulation. And this is where sometimes the ovarian wall stretches and pain receptors fire. And some females, maybe about 10%, can actually feel this and notice when they're ovulating. And it's kind of a dull, constant pain that starts and then kind of lasts for 12 to 20 or 24 to 48 hours. And there's Mittelstaining as well, which is bleeding during ovulation. And some people have that, which is also called spotting. Now, usually one oocyte is released. However, if two are developing at the exact same time, and usually one is released, and then all the others kind of get shut down and kind of just break down and go away. But if two are being developed exactly at the same time, and we have two Graafian follicles exactly at the same time, we will get multiple fertilizations potentially, because we'll have multiple ovulations. And we have multiple births, which could be fraternal or non-identical twins, right? Because we'll have two different eggs and two different sperm will fertilize them, and so those are non-identical twins. Identical twins would result if one of the eggs, one egg is fertilized by one sperm, and then it divides and separates, and then both of them implant. And then that way you have two individuals with the same genetic material implanted in different places in the uterus, and then you get identical twins. All right. Now, our last phase, the luteal phase, is, I'm going to write 7 through 9 because it starts immediately after 7, or during 7, and then continues through these last couple steps there. So following ovulation, the Graafian follicle collapses, and it changes its name to the corpus hemorrhagium, and the hemorrhage part makes you think because the antrum fills with blood, and then it afterwards shortly becomes the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum is mostly fat-filled. It's now mostly fat, right? Now, what will happen to the corpus luteum is going to depend on whether or not the oocyte is fertilized. Okay, so if not if the corpus luteum, if that's funny, if let's cross that out. If the oocyte oocyte, oh my gosh, is fertilized, it'll continue to produce hormones, progesterone, and so this is where, there we go. I understand why there was a problem there. The it now is referring to the corpus luteum. So if the oocyte is fertilized, the corpus luteum, will continue to produce the hormones progesterone and some estrogen until the placenta takes over. So in this case, that it there, if you need to make yourself a note, that it is not referring to the oocyte, it is referring to the corpus luteum. This will happen as a result of human chorionic gonadotropin being released by the implanted fertilized egg. Okay, so that means what we're saying there is that this human chorionic gonadotropin is released by the implanted fertilized egg, and that will kind of stimulate and continue the corpus luteum to do its job. If it's not fertilized, and again, the not is the oocyte, so if no fertilization occurs, okay, the corpus luteum will really reach its maximum development in about 7 to 10 days. I know it says 8 there, but about a week to 10 days. And then it degenerates and becomes the corpus albicans. And the corpus albicans then will just kind of slowly involute and kind of break itself down, and there'll just be a little tiny line at the very end where it was before, like almost like a little tiny scar, little fibrous tissue that remains. Okay, now let's relate a little bit of that to the hormonal regulation of the ovarian cycle. Now, this picture is, they don't have this exact picture, and I like our picture quite a bit here because I think it does a good job it's showing everything. It's basically page 1075, has a couple pictures that are like it, but we're going to use this one. And I think this is really good. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill it in. And we're going to see all the numbers there. I'm going to put the numbers on the next page as well. So first off, how do we establish the ovarian cycle? How does it start? Well, at puberty, the hypothalamus will begin to release GnRH cyclically, monthly. And this will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, which will act on the ovaries, right? So the anterior pituitary will release FSH and LH, and that'll act on the ovaries to release estrogen and progesterone, and then act on the uterus. So we have these multiple cycles that are occurring. However, those hormone levels are not consistent at first. And so ovulation may not occur immediately. So the gonadotropic hormone levels stabilize with the onset of menarche, and menarche is the beginning of the menstrual cycle. But menses may still be anovulatory for up to 2 years. That's not for certain, and we wouldn't know that for sure, but it takes time for the hormone levels to kind of sync up and have everything work, and so every single ovulatory cycle would result in an oocyte being released. Okay, now we're going to go back and forth between this. First off, the things that are in blue here are stimulatory, and the things that are in the red dotted line are inhibitory. Right? So that's the first thing to think about. And we now are going to go to the next page, and we're going to start reading this, and then we're going to put in what we're reading onto this so it makes sense. Okay? So, follicle growth and oocyte development is controlled by FSH and LH. The first day of the cycle. So what we're doing is we're looking at the first day of the cycle. And I want to point out something real quickly. I'm going to talk about and use this picture a tiny bit here. And this picture is a few pages farther in your notes as well. And I can find the exact, it's on page 1077. We'll highlight that later. And what we're looking at here is what's happening in the ovary, what's happening in the uterus, right? Well, I guess I should really say what's happening in the ovary is here. This is physically what's happening, and this is the hormone levels. And then this is what's happening up in the anterior pituitary. And then down at the bottom, what's happening to the uterus, especially the functional layer and how it's changing. So all of this information together shows how the uterine and the ovarian cycles work together. And they start here at day 0, and they go to ovulation, which is about halfway through, and then they end around day 28. And you can see those days here at the bottom. So this is a really great one to get comfortable with and understand this chart, because it'll help you kind of relate what's happening at each phase all the time. So we're starting here. We're starting here at day 0, and we're looking at the levels of the different hormones and what's happening during ovulation. Okay? Now we'll go back and spend most of our time on this page though, and the page before. So the first day of the cycle, GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, releases, so number 1, FSH, and number 2, LH. Okay? So those two things happen. So where's that? That is right here. So we have GnRH coming down from hypothalamus, right? Going to the anterior pituitary, and it is going to cause FSH and LH to be released. Now, I'm going to write over here LH and FSH also here, and we'll get back to that in a minute. Okay, so we've got GnRH releasing number 1, and we have FSH and LH. Actually, let's change the, I have an idea here, make this more correct. Let's change this number 1 to be here, so we know it's right when GnRH gets released. That would make more sense. Okay, so we have GnRH release, number 1, FSH and LH gets released into the bloodstream. And as I was saying before, about 20 to 25 primary follicles are activated monthly by hormonal stimulation, and they all start to produce low levels of estrogen. And these are the follicular cells that surround the oocyte. The granulosa cells that start to get produced later also will secrete inhibin, right? So we start with estrogen levels being very low, and then a little bit later, as we develop into like secondary and stuff, we start to have granulosa cells, and inhibin gets produced. And these are both under the influence of FSH and LH. Okay, now, so FSH and LH target these cells, and these get secreted. Now, a small increase in plasma estrogen levels cause a negative feedback on both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Now I want to note what's happening there, and I want to put a number 3 over here. So if you have low levels of plasma estrogen, so estrogen's in the blood, this will cause a negative feedback on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So what happens? This will cause that LH and FSH won't be released. So I'm going to write a little note here that is related to this. So I'm going to say they don't release, but keep producing and store FSH and LH. Okay, so this is a key point, and we'll highlight it in a different color just so we can see it here. Okay. Now, let's go back and look at number 3. So, right here at number 3, what we see is slightly increased estrogen, and to a lesser case, some of that inhibin that was being produced are going to shut off the anterior pituitary and hypothalamus from releasing more FSH and LH. But what will happen is FSH and LH will build up and keep being made here and will concentrate there. But we're not going to release it yet. Okay? Now, so that's a negative feedback. However, and we can actually let's change the color since we're changing the feedback loop here. Let's change it to, I don't know, this pink color. Inside the ovary, the FSH that had been released in the estrogen will work as positive feedback, okay? And that will cause more follicular growth and maturation, and now there are more cells to produce more estrogen. So think of it this way. As the cells around the oocyte are going from one layer to 2 layers to multiple layers, we have more and more and more cells. So there's more follicular cells. those follicular cells produce more estrogen. So the more cells we make, the more estrogen we produce, and that's why it's a positive feedback loop. So the FSH will stimulate it, make more cells. Those cells make more estrogen, and estrogen levels are now going up. Okay, so estrogen levels, the cells getting bigger, the cells around the oocyte are getting bigger. We can see here we have more cells, right? So estrogen levels, so now we have large increase in estrogen, and this is more the positive feedback, estrogen levels, right? Because we're getting more cells and we're getting more estrogen produced, right? And that is going to be our next thing here. So we'll go back to, we'll keep it this color. So large amount of plasma estrogen now, because we're making more and more, cause positive feedback on both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And this is number 4. I'll move it up so you can make sure you know it's for this one. Number 4. That's what I just drew in right here. This is number 4. This is positive feedback. This is negative feedback. So now we have a positive feedback. So what is that going to do? Well, as we have these high levels of estrogen go to that, we will then result in, and we can put it back in yellow here, the result will be a large sudden surge of LH release about mid-cycle. Now, let me just state that it's not just LH. It is actually both LH and FSH. Let's look at this here. So LH levels, basically we're staying flat because we weren't releasing anymore. FSH, we're staying basically flat. We weren't releasing anymore. And then midway through the cycle, at about day 14, when all that high amount of estrogen, so here's our estrogen going up, causing positive feedback, and then it causes an LH surge and a very small FSH surge. But the LH is the more important one. And that is number 5 on our list here. So let's go look at number 5. That was where I had talked about the LH and FSH being released again in a very strong manner, a lot at one time, and this causes the LH surge. And what does that do? It goes here and it causes 6, and 6 is ovulation. So that LH surge is what causes the primary oocyte to complete its first meiotic division, and it will produce enzymes that rupture the ovary, and ovulation occurs. Now, that means, remember what happens then, the oocyte, or unfertilized egg, goes into the peritoneal cavity, and then gets swept up by the fimbriae and enters into the uterine tube if everything's working correctly. Now, what we've done, though, is we've damaged the whole follicular structure. And so, at this point, estrogen levels drop sharply due to all of the damaged follicular cells. They're all dying or dead, and they don't produce as much estrogen. So our estrogen levels drop off really quickly. And so if we go look here, all of a sudden, estrogen levels really drop off as we damage all the follicular cells and ovulation occurs, and they go back to pretty low levels. Okay? So that is, so we need to put in number 6 here for ovulation. Sorry, we'll move it. Excuse me. It has to happen at least once per lecture, but it wants to go somewhere else. Number 6. And we'll put that over here. That's number 6. Okay. And as we just said, we're going to have damaged follicular cells, and estrogen levels will drop a lot, and that gives us number 7. And we'll go here and look at what happens at number 7. Our estrogen levels go down. So now we are at, we have low estrogen, but we have relatively high progesterone. We'll talk about why in a second. and we have still relatively high inhibin, and we'll get to why in a second there. So 7 is we're going to reduce our estrogen levels. But LH will cause the damaged follicle to turn into the corpus hemorrhagium. So that's important. So the LH will cause the damaged follicle to become that, the blood-filled follicle, and then eventually the corpus luteum, which is the fat-filled follicle, and that corpus luteum will start to produce progesterone primarily and a small amount of estrogen. And now that is where we get to number 8. So we have a lot of progesterone, a little bit of estrogen, a little bit of leftover inhibin that was produced. And so those levels of low estrogen, progesterone, and a little bit of inhibin cause negative feedback. And so 8 is actually both of these things here. 8 is this, and 8 is that. 8 is both of those terms together. And that is going to cause negative feedback and stop the FSH and the LH release. And this will cause inhibition of new follicular development. So if we go over and look here, we're going to have an increase in progesterone from the corpus luteum. We're going to have a little bit of an increase in estrogen. These two things will shut off LH and FSH production, and they'll stay relatively low again. That will then make sure that we don't re-stimulate and make more of these primary oocytes, secondary oocytes, because once we've released the egg, we don't want to have, say, 4, 5, 6 days later, another ovulation occurring. Because if we fertilize both, we would have problems, because we would have one pregnancy that was ahead of the other pregnancy, and we wouldn't want that. And so we generally only want one pregnancy at a time anyway, so we want to make sure that we stop this from happening. So if fertilization occurs, one thing will happen. If fertilization doesn't, another thing will happen, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But here's our low estrogen, high progesterone, and a little bit of inhibin left over, causing negative feedback, shutting this whole thing back down. Okay? So reread that, make sure you understand that part. But now let's look at what happens here. So with the low levels of plasma luteinizing hormone, and the corpus luteum activity goes down, then we'll lower our estrogen and progesterone releases. Okay? So if we don't have, so what we want to say here is, let's put over to the side here. If no fertilization, what will happen is our corpus luteum activity will drop, our estrogen and progesterone release will drop, so all hormone levels will drop, and that will allow the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, to start produce FSH and LH, and we'll start the new cycle over, right? We'll just go back to number 1 again. However, if there's no fertilization, but if there is fertilization, what will happen is we'll get continuation of the corpus luteum, because and then it'll keep producing progesterone, and the ovum will be maintained by human chorionic gonadotropin, an LH-like hormone that's being produced by the placenta eventually. So this will then result in the corpus luteum still maintaining until the placenta is completely developed and can kind of take over. And what will happen if we look at this is, normally if we don't have fertilization, the corpus luteum will degenerate and become a corpus albicans, and as it degenerates, our progesterone and our estrogen levels will go down, and we will get sloughing off of, then we won't maintain our uterine lining. We'll talk about that in a minute, and we'll have menstruation, and we'll start all over again. However, if we do have fertilization, this high level of progesterone will maintain, so this line would go like this, and the estrogen level would probably stay about like that, and the corpus luteum would not degenerate, and it would stay at a constant state until the placenta is well established and the embryo and fetus are developing. Okay, so now that brings us into the uterine cycle. And so what we can do now is we can kind of compare what we just talked about in the ovarian cycle and see what's happening in the uterine cycle at the same time. So this is that bottom layer of this diagram that I just had up. See down here at the bottom? There it is. Now, there are three phases that we see here: the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, and the secretory phase. So we're going to start in the menstrual phase, which is the beginning of a new cycle. It's the end of an old cycle, but a beginning of a new cycle. Okay, so what happens for each of these? So in the menstrual phase, or uterine phase, in the menstrual phase, well, actually, let me go back. Let's read this before we go. So each month, what we're going to do is we're going to go from the menstrual phase and we're going to slowly thicken the functional layer of the uterus in preparation to receive a fertilized egg, an ovum. So the uterus is kind of a hopeful organ. It prepares itself every month for fertilization and implantation. Now, if it doesn't get that, then this tissue that it all had prepared will slough off and will go back here to a very thin functional layer, and then the next month we'll start again and try again. Okay? So if no implantation is occurring, the functionalis layer will be sloughed off, and that's menses. So we're going to start in the menstrual cycle, the first 5 days of the whole cycle. So what's happening in the ovary? Well, we said that growing follicles start to produce estrogen due to FSH and LH, but only slight amount at first, and we get that negative feedback that we talked about, right? So that's all review, what we just talked about on the last page. But in the uterus, the functionalis is detaching from the basalis, the uterine wall, and we call this menstrual flow. It's usually between 50 and 150 milliliters, and it's generally about 3 to 5 days on average, but of course, that's going to vary by person a lot, right? And so we get down to a very low functionalis layer. The basal layer always maintains because that's what builds the functional layer. And now, around day 5, we start the proliferative phase. So on day 6 to 14. So what's happening in the ovary then? Well, we have larger follicles, right? We have more follicular cells, and we get our increase in estrogen, and then we get our LH surge and FSH a little bit, and that causes ovulation. Okay? And that happens right at day 14, so that's the end. And then we have a decrease of ovulation due to the follicle breaking down. So again, I'll review from what we just talked about. So what's happening in the uterus? Well, during this time, we're going to grow, repair, and thicken the functional layer. And we'll get a bunch of arteries increasing in number, and we're going to get tissue and glands growing. So we're going to get increase in vascularization, and we're going to get upregulation of progesterone receptors. So it's going to be very sensitive progesterone. During this time, we also thin the cervical mucus, and that will allow sperm to travel through the cervical canal. So up until this point, the mucus is much thicker, and so sperm will have a harder time entering from the vaginal canal into the cervical canal. But at this point, because we're ovulating, the female is ovulating, the mucus will thin and allow the sperm in at a higher rate to hopefully get implantation or get fertilization and then implantation. Now, so that's on day 14. And if you see here, right at day 14, we're not quite at our maximum state, but we're really close. And this is where ovulation occurs. And it continues to grow, because implantation would occur sometime in this phase after, because if ovulation occurs here, fertilization would occur most likely at this time frame, and implantation would occur at most likely this time frame. Now we're in the secretory or post-ovulatory phase, and this is the last 14 days of the cycle. Now remember, the corpus luteum is being maintained for a little while and producing a lot of progesterone, and the uterine is sensitive progesterone now. So what does it do? Well, the uterine keeps developing. It elaborates arteries, more arteries, lots of glycogen secreting glands, and this makes sense because this will help sustain the embryo, because glycogen is glucose, and glucose can be food for the embryo. Progesterone will also form a cervical plug, and this will re-thicken the mucus. It will fill the cervical canal, and this provides a sterile environment within the uterus. Again, assuming that fertilization and implantation is going to occur, that's starting to happen. However, if no fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum will degenerate, as we said, and that leads to decreased levels of progesterone. When progesterone is not around, then that means that the endometrium will start to self-digest. It'll start to break down. The arteries will kink and spasm, and this will lead to decreases in oxygen and nutrients. Now, we don't want the entire uterus to get damaged, and so what happens is during this process, in an effort to save the uterine basal lining, there's this increase in blood flow, and we get a dilation of fragile capillaries, and they get destroyed. And this is part of the menstrual fluid that we see during menstruation. So that's where the tissue and the blood is going to, kind of start to come out at that point. Now, if there's fertilization, then obviously this wouldn't happen, and this nice thick layer will get maintained until implantation happens, fertilization and implantation, and this will stay thick throughout the remainder of the pregnancy. Now, as we said here, what this whole picture is correlating all that. And so you can at any point start here, look down and see where estrogen levels are, where progesterone levels are, where ovulation is, so on and so forth, what the uterus looks like. So I'm not going to go over that anymore because we've gone over it, but you can use that to help you review and study for the exam, so you kind of know what's happening at each step. Okay, we're on our last page here. So we want to look at what are the extrauterine effects of progesterone and estrogen, because we've kind of now highlighted everything that it does for the ovary and for the uterus. So estrogen is going to grow, develop, and maintain female reproductive structures. So estrogen levels throughout our life kind of maintain female growth during puberty and development during puberty, and then maintain female reproductive structures. It also stimulates secondary sex characteristics, and we already know it does oogenesis, so I'm just adding other ones here. And it also does the growth spurt at puberty, along with growth hormone. And then progesterone prepares both the endometrium for implantation and the mammary glands for milk secretion. So I'm going to write the word both. Prepares both the endometrium for implantation and the mammary glands for milk secretion. And then relaxin, which is a hormone we didn't talk about, but I'm going to mention it now, is a hormone that relaxes the symphysis pubis. Remember, that's the cartilaginous joint that's between the two pubic bones in the front, and it helps also dilate the cervix to facilitate delivery. So that's interesting about that hormone. Now, some developmental aspects about puberty. Females tend to reach puberty about a year earlier than males, and the start of puberty is marked by menarche, which is the first episode of menstrual bleeding. As we said, that may not be an ovulatory event. And then, of course, there are other events during puberty: the enlargement of the reproductive organs, hair growth, changes in fat and muscle deposition on the body. And this is mostly the result of increased estrogen. That's an up arrow. Increased estrogen. Males, same thing, except it's due to an increase, not in estrogen, but an increase in testosterone. Same thing, enlargement of reproductive organs, hair growth, voice changes, musculoskeletal development occurs during that time. All right, and then the last thing we want to talk about is menopause. And so menopause, the formal definition, so let's say the formal definition is, because menopause is due to the decline of estrogen production and then cycles that are anovulatory, no ovulation. shorter menstrual period and lighter menstrual period. But the formal definition is when 1 year has passed without menstruation due to all estrogen-dependent tissue atrophy, getting less, it's reducing in size. So the breasts and the genital organs are not producing as much estrogen anymore, and it's not enough to cause the LH surge and the FSH surge. So that is the formal definition of menopause. Okay, so we have now covered everything that you need for Bio 233 to get prepared for your final. So review this material, look to see what you understood right away, what was confusing, go back and look at that. If you have any questions, please talk with your instructors via email or any other way, and we will answer questions for you to get you ready for the exam. All right, good luck studying. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.